Hi, listeners. Do I have a legal tech episode for you? My guest has been the Innovation Officer of an Am Law 100 firm, Head of eDiscovery, and Associate General Counsel for the Business Innovation Lab of a Fortune 10 company. And currently, he's the Chief Innovation Officer at UnitedLex, where they partner with law firms and in-house teams. We discussed data. We discussed AI. We discussed talent, strategy, and what does legal tech look like in 10 years, and so much more. So, welcome, Aaron, to the Future is Bright podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
Chris, thank you for having me.
So, love to talk. As my audience understands this process, let's talk about Genesis. So, you're a California guy. You were raised outside of the Bay, if I understand correctly?
Yeah, that's right. I'm predominantly raised just outside of San Francisco in the East Bay. So kind of that whole, late 80s, early 90s, or actually all of the 90s, Bay Area, Silicon Valley sort of fusion. Grew up in that.
And you chose UC Davis for your undergrad. And then did you always know you're going to be a lawyer, or how did that evolve?
No, I think anybody who knew me as a kid probably guessed that I was going to grow up to be a lawyer, but no, I kind of messed around with a whole bunch of stuff until landing in the law. So, a bunch of sciencey type stuff, and then ultimately decided that legal was the path, kind of best suited my skill set.
So knowing you're in that area, Bay Area, Silicon Valley, and you're right in the middle of the tech bubble as it's really kind of coming up, were you rubbing shoulders with other people who were either in startups or doing things with technology?
Yeah, that was a really like that the whole Bay Area thing. It was probably more interesting. It's interesting now, but it was probably more interesting 20 years ago than it is
Hmm.
now. When uh, I started out practicing in San Francisco, right around 2004, 2005, and the the .com bubble had just sort of burst. You were watching sort of a whole bunch of folks who had gone from a place where they'd be in restaurants paying for dinner with stock companies, and restaurants were that, right, to a place where that whole thing had kind of popped, and it was thought to be like the internet was kind of like this, yeah, it's not going to be a thing, and then it really became, in its 2.0 version, it became a thing. And so watching that at ground zero as a very young professional, or kind of as I was finishing my educational career and becoming a very
Hmm.
professional, was absolutely fascinating. And then I think, as you know, I've been in and around the kind of the startups for years and years and years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's dive into that. So you became a litigator in trade secrets, is that correct?
Yeah, I was a litigator out of the box. I was really lucky. I got hired out of law school by a guy named James Lassart, and Jim is probably one of the best litigators that has walked the planet in the last 100 years, whatever. Former AUSA, he was like
Mhm.
head of President Reagan's like OSADEF task force, like he did that kind of stuff. Uh,
Wow.
Brigadier General, um, and he had this great like team that he had built. A guy named Ben Driscoll who taught me a lot. A woman named Suzanne Richmond who taught me a lot. They've been in and around the San Francisco kind of litigation space for a very long time. They're all wicked smart. Um, and so, yeah, Jim hired me to kind of build a trial lawyer from the ground up. I was very, very lucky in that respect, and then got recruited to Littler.
Yeah. So talk about that. Were you getting calls from other firms, or did you know people at Littler?
Yeah, no, I was getting calls and stuff from other firms, but I got Littler wanted me to come over as a trade secrets trial lawyer, like to come
Hmm.
do that trade secret work. I was technical, so I could do the forensics pieces of it. Um, and I'd had a fair amount of exposure to it. And then, um, and when I was a baby, like brand new lawyer, so Zubelik had come down, the case had come down in 2004, and so I'm a baby lawyer in like 2005, and Jim, a couple of things that I'll never forget. saying to me. One of them was, the most important thing for you to know is you don't know anything. Uh, that one has always kind of stuck with me. And then, one of the other things he said is there's this like there's this thing that's calling it e-discovery, and it's computer stuff. So somebody needs to learn that. It's not going to be me because he was in his probably early 60s at the time. And so like, good luck, kid. Um, so that's kind of how I got started. And so when I landed at Littler, I was doing trade secret work and doing some discovery stuff. And then Littler hired the guy who ultimately became like my mentor, a guy named Paul Wiener, who, again, I'm just been so lucky in that space. He is so smart. He's a great leader, but he's an amazing lawyer. Uh, and they hired Paul to build and run the e-discovery at Littler. And like begged, borrowed, and stole my way into the group. Um, when he first came on board, actually, my very first phone call, I got a phone call with him, and he was like, "Hey, I hear you're doing some e-discovery stuff on the West Coast," and I was like, "Yeah," and I was very excited to like meet him and all this stuff. And he's like, "Yeah, I need you to stop doing that." And I was like, why don't you, like, instead of that, why don't you like your group? And his comment was essentially like, "No, I need people who know what they're doing." So so call me later, kind of thing. And I probably spent the next like 6 months chasing him around, to get him to give me a shot. So, but it ultimately worked out. I say all the time, like, to the extent that there are things that are wrong with me, it's Paul's fault because Paul built.
So what's so interesting is, I mean, you're working on hardware, probably high school and college, like 386, 486. Did you work on even the older devices too? Because I'm thinking you're in that area, and this is the business you're getting into.
Yeah, it is really interesting. Like, I did my first couple years of undergrad at a school called Rensselaer in upstate New York, and I was really there to play soccer. All of the school stuff was kind of
Yeah.
secondary, but the one of the big benefits of being there was how technical the like core curriculum was, right? So, um, I grew up in a house where we always had like a Mac
Mm.
laying around the place, right? And so computers weren't new to me. In fact, we always had an Atari around the house. We always had, you know what I mean? Like, that stuff was part of the kind of culture of the
Hmm.
family. It wasn't until I really got to Rensselaer that I started learning the technical pieces of it, and it's because it was core to the curriculum, not because I was smart enough to choose any of that stuff. Like, I say my one of my superpowers is I'm too dumb to be afraid, um, and I try. I kind of run through the doors. I run at doors like they're open most of the time, but not always. Sometimes you take first into that thing. Um, but the all of that technical work at Rensselaer was just like one of those doors that magically opened.
So, with you doing e-discovery at Littler, I mean, were you rubbing shoulders with colleagues at all the other major firms trying to do that too, or were there very many firms you're aware of that were doing this?
So yeah, so I'm what I like to call like Gen
Okay.
2 of Edis, right? I've been around now for a long time. Like, my facial hair is going white. Says everything about like where I am in my cycle. But um, there was this whole troop of people that I was really lucky to spend a lot of time with. I mean, so Paul took me under his wing, and he really built me. And I got to spend um, 5 or 6 years building and running that e-discovery group with him. Um, and that was it was a real treat, professionally, to spend that much time that close with Paul and able to really like download the way his brain works. He and I are opposites in a lot of ways. He is the most prepared person I've ever met in my life. Like, he lives by stacks of binders, and he's always got binders, and I'm like, let's go.
Yeah.
Like, we know this well enough to be able to do it. Like, let's go do it, right? So I think we always balanced each other, kind of. But beyond Paul, or because of Paul, right? I met all of these folks. It, Browning, right? Browning Marin at DLA, who was kind of like, the godfather to lots of us. Wendy Butler Curtis, when she was standing up kind of Oric and their whole e-discovery thing. And, now she's like one of the gurus of legal innovation, right? So kind of watching Wendy's career has been super interesting. Tess Blair, as she was standing up what Morgan Lewis was doing, she just retired, and now my friend Scott Milner is, running that. So, Jonathan Rosenthal at Winston and Strawn, David Kessler at what's now Norton Rose, right? Like, you know, I remember when I was in house, David asking me to, essentially like write a piece to help Andrea D'Ambra become a partner at DLA. Right? Like I've been so lucky to grow up in this community of like really really smart people, and to be able to just learn from them constantly. I mean, when I was at Littler toward the end, before I went in house at Walmart, I had this major case, and I had. There was a major case that was venued down in Fort Lauderdale, and I had, Connor Crowley and Ron Hedges against me on the other side. You know what I mean? Like it's just it's it's a small but deep community, and all of those people taught me a lot in the process. Sometimes it was a lesson in a case, right? On the other side, on the like end of something. And sometimes it was just, sitting down and talking to people about, well, how do you think about that? And why do you do it that way? And what do you think that should be? And people just kind enough to share the way they think, so that, that and absorb it. Um, Dan Regard, I mean, I've known Dan Regard for, God, my whole career, more or less. uh, Warren Cruz and Anton Litchfield. I mean, those guys taught me forensics. Like my career has basically just been me being lucky enough to rub shoulders with a lot of really smart people.
It's amazing. What a gift to have those opportunities. So, was Walmart a client of Littler? How did that take place with you getting recruited over there?
Yeah, again, right. My power, not smart enough to be afraid. So yes, they were a client. So think about exactly how that came together. Uh, Walmart was a major client of Littler, um, and Paul was supposed to do a speaking engagement at the Walmart home office in Bentonville. Um, his wife Sarah was pregnant with one of his daughters. I can't remember, and Sarah was like going into labor, about to go into labor. I don't remember exactly what details. Paul called me one day and he was like, "Hey, I'm supposed to give a speech at Walmart, but could you go instead?" And so I said, "Sure." And I flew to Bentonville, and I did this speaking. And um, afterward, they were essentially like, "Are you doing work for us?" And I was like, "No." They were like, "Why not?" Uh, and so I started doing work for them, and I really started being their primary e-discovery counsel, kind of that national coordinating council role, for e-discovery for them. And I did that for a while, a year and something. And then they came to me and said, um, essentially, we would like for you to come do this in house. We'd like to build what you're doing for us, we'd like to build that in house. So why don't you come here? And I was like, absolutely not. Um, I had I had I had made shareholder at Littler has partners, and so I had made shareholder at Littler in
Okay.
2013, and then I had been elevated to equity shareholder in 2014. So I was like a shareholder, non-equity, for like a year, and then a year later they made me equity. So Walmart's reaching out to me in like 2014, like I just made didn't make sense, and so I was like, I no, but I will help you fill it. I'll help find you somebody.
Okay.
And so, you know, I sent them resumes of people, so many people who were so good, and for whatever reason, they were like, no, 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 no. Uh, and 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 finally, they came back to me and they were like, what
Yeah.
would it take? And I made what I thought was like an extravagant, over the top demand, and they were like, done.
And you're like,
Hey, two things happened. One, Bentonville, and two, man, I left some
yep,
comp table
yep,
there.
sounds
Like
like it.
that was way too quick of a yes. Um, yeah, and so moved to Bentonville and did the in-house thing for several years.
Okay, so you're not the first person I know that has left California to go to Bentonville in a legal role, and and now you're back in California. What was it like working for the Fortune 1 company in Bentonville?
So I kind of have to probably break
Okay,
that one apart. One, Bentonville is the coolest place I've
okay,
ever lived. Uh, and every time I say that, people's jaws
you're
hit the
right.
floor. Uh, but Northwest Arkansas is astounding.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Um, there is there is so much money, and there are such accomplished people in a very small space, because you have world headquarters for Fortune
Hmm.
1 is
Hmm.
Bentonville, right? Next town, Rogers is world headquarters for Behind Transportation, so like major logistics company. The next town down is world headquarters for Tyson Foods, largest food company, right? The next town down is Fayetteville, which is where the University of Arkansas is. And then everybody who services, Walmart, JB Hunt, Tyson's, like they all have big campuses there. So like Unilever has a big presence, Pepsi has a huge presence, Coke
Hmm.
has a huge presence, and that draw of like executive talent and all of the people that are doing all of that work, it creates a space where, like Bentonville, particularly in probably the last 15 years, um, like the restaurant scene is amazing. The bar scene, the art scene, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. Like, if you're into art and you haven't been there, you're missing out. Like Moshe Safdie was the architect for it. It's extraordinary, and it's free. Um, so it's an incredible place. If I had known what my career was going to do, I would probably still live in
Really?
Bentonville.
Wow.
Yeah, I probably back. So like Bentonville was amazing, and similarly Walmart, amazing. Like again, I learned a lot. You can't really help
Hmm.
but be dropped in at a kind of a fairly high executive level inside of Fortune 1, and be in those rooms and not just like
Yeah.
absorb
Yeah.
a lot. Uh, I was Senior Associate General Counsel and Global Head of eDiscovery, and I reported to um, the Global Head of Litigation, a guy named Mike Bennett. And Mike was like, he was a partner in the Rose Law Firm with Hillary
Okay.
Clinton, and had done some other thing, had been like a big litigator in Dallas, and then had come in house. And he was another guy where, you could just spend
Yeah.
a day after day after day, and just absorb um, how it all worked. It was extraordinary. I have been really, really lucky, um, in every move that I've made, to be with really bright people and just be allowed to learn from them and absorb from them and grab their bag of tricks and make it my own.
You had shared with me being a part of the innovation lab. Did they have that? Did you build that? What does that mean at Walmart?
Yeah. No, again, super lucky, right? So Walmart has an innovation lab. Um, and around it's not innovation around legal, it's innovation around the
Okay.
business.
Cool.
So it's innovation in, the application of data science to figure out, like, the analytics team there figured out, for instance, that when I was there, that you know strawberry pop tarts and bottled water to the cashiers in the run up to a hurricane, like store sales go up 30% or whatever, right? Like they were doing that kind of work very early on, and really figuring out like these
Wow.
these kind of causal effects of various things, and then taking that and applying that to the business. Looking at the various ways technology could improve the business, thinking about like I mean, how that place thinks and works. They have these massive warehouses that are set up that have multiple versions of a store in them, like side by side by
Interesting.
side, and they lay out inventory differently and then put people through them to walk the box to figure out what the most successful
Floor plan.
basket.
Interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're doing stuff like that, and so again, it was a space where, because I was on the data side of things, I got come and be their lawyer for a lot of the time I was there, and just see what they were working on and how they thought about innovation and how they executed innovation. That really, I think, shaped the way I think about that in the roles I've had since Walmart. Right, I was doing innovation at Walmart, although we weren't calling it that. But the roles post have all been very like innovation centric, and I think a lot of the fundamentals of how that works I learned from this group of kind of mad scientists. Cool stuff in the
I can imagine it's like a data analytics dream, everything that they're crunching and putting all this data together and driving decisions, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, one of the first guys that I really saw, my friend Tarek, who was there, and he was kind of legal ops at Walmart, and Tarek was really the first guy who was like, these are the things I'd like to be able to see, or the, and so like having somebody articulate um, in very concrete ways, like if I could see these things, then I think I could fix these things over here, right? Um, and having somebody really articulate that in very concrete terms and give examples of it, and then watch that play out in successful fashion, was a incredibly beneficial process.
So, you had a couple of years in Bentonville, and then you got a call again from Littler. Is that correct?
Yeah, my Paul, Paul called me, and Littler was getting ready to. Littler had been doing some data analytics stuff for a while, and they were looking to basically standardize and kind of pull that into a formal practice, and then scale it. And so I got asked to come in as the chief officer, which again, it was really an innovation role, but around data and analytics and the application of data to law, thinking about how you improve the practice of law through leveraging data. So we were doing cool stuff like in wage and hour, like class actions, pulling structured and structurable data. Um, and leveraging that to build profiles of people's
Hmm.
days. So you think about the way like a wage and class action has gone historically, the way people have always litigated, and the way a lot of people litigate them today, is you go to the client, you're like, hey, give me your time punch data and give me your pay data, and I'm going to overlay those, and you owe $11 billion, right? The time punch data is never good, and people are punching people in and people out. Everybody knows it's unreliable, but you can't. It's really difficult to prove that a lot of the time. Um, we were starting to do stuff like we would collect like badge swipes, system logins, and activity logs for the systems that people had to be in to do their jobs. Soft phones and Teams and Salesforce and email and like whatever they had to be in to do their jobs. GPS data out of trucks and stuff like that, and you can stack that data together to get a sense of when people are active in the systems they need to be in to do their jobs. And you can build profiles of people's days, right? And then figure out like, you know, these guys over here, like they're punched in, but they're not active. They're active for like 2 hours in the morning, and then they go dark for 4 hours, and they're active for 2 hours in the afternoon, and then they're dark by 2 o'clock. So not only did they not work overtime, but yeah, they definitely took a lunch, definitely took a break. You don't owe them anything, right? My friend and former partner Don Myers used to call it having the answer to the test before you walked in the room. Just incredibly powerful. Or doing things like taking in class actions, taking pools of looking at like, for instance, for retail stores, and we did this for a coffee chain, right? Like looking at all of the various locations and looking at locations that are in policy, not a lot of violations, right? And locations that are out of policy. And you can use that to steer the lawyers to, if you're taking statements, the statements come from these stores over here because they're in policy, right? Like and then when you look at the stores that are out of policy, starting to break the reasons that they're out of policy apart. So to say, yeah, all of these stores are out of policy, but they're all out of policy in different ways and for different reasons. So they're not a class, right? Just these very effective ways of thinking about the application of data to.
So it's all about reduction of liability to the client, and you guys are dismantling the plaintiff's arguments against them through these
Yep.
tools.
And that was the major thrust of that practice, and then helping clients build or license and leverage algorithmic technology, right? Helping folks who were building AI models that they were rolling out, helping that. That was
So,
another.
so you guys were developing your own tools and licensing it out?
We did develop our own tools. We didn't
Okay.
license stuff. We developed, so for instance, like another example of the way that practice worked. We built a tool called the Littler Pay Equity Assessment Tool, and it was a SQL backend, really nice dashboards, a lot of Python in between. And Littler had a pay equity practice for a long time. It was one of kind of the pioneers working with clients on that subject. And my friend Denise Visconti really kind of was the kind of the marshal, or the kind of the person who helped really put that practice together and drive it. But what they were doing is they were like, think about lawyers who are really good at statistics, right? That's essentially the kind of lawyers who do, pay equity work. And they were giving clients a spreadsheet with essentially statistical analysis in it, which, unless you speak statistics,
Greek.
is what I call drawerware, right? Like, thank you very much. Open the drawer, put it in, close the drawer, never
Right.
look at it again. And so a lot of that practice was talking to, folks in mid-level in the HR organization of a client, kind of thing. And Denise and another partner of mine, Alan, had this, idea that, like, hey, if we could really standardize the way we analyze this stuff, and if we could, build algorithms that kind of allow us to analyze on the fly and tweak the various factors that contribute to pay equity or diminish from that concept. And if we could show that to clients in a dashboard rather than in a spreadsheet, that practice could be much more impactful for clients,
Valuable.
right? And they didn't articulate it exactly that way in the first instance. It was like, what's the biggest roadblock to the practice? And it's like, well, we give clients a spreadsheet. Most of them don't speak statistics, right? So working backward from that premise, like, well, what if we could visualize it and dashboard it, right? And so like that came onto the board. So we're going to integrate there, and then it's like, and one of the other big friction points was every time they were like doing an analysis, they would have to do that analysis again and again and again if the client wanted tweaks. Like, well, what if we changed this? What would it look like? They'd have to go back and do that all over again. And so building a tool that solved both those problems massively up-leveled that practice. It allowed them to go from talking to kind of the middle of an HR group to advising the board on compensation issues. And made the value of what the client was paying for, that much more
Mhm.
significant, which was a really big
Yeah,
deal.
so you stepped into Littler in this innovation role, and there was kind of no zero, like zero revenue, and you grew it to 10 million. Is that correct for a practice?
Yeah, so I mean that was a process. It was a team, and we went from like zero to and zero is overstating it, right? I mean there was revenue, it just wasn't kind of put together and figured out and whatever, but effectively zero. Went from zero to about 2.6 million, I think, in year one, and then um, like maybe 4.8, and then 6 or 7 or whatever, and then in the fourth year we were running a $10 million clip, um, and it was just this very like methodical process of like bringing people into the fold, helping them understand the power that data could have, listening to the problems that they were having in their practice and the places where it was sticky or inefficient or things that they thought they could do more for clients if they only had dot dot dot, and then really being kind of the fulfillment mechanism for that.
So leaping forward, and we'll just go, yeah. So what's the tie-in to UnitedLex? How did you get there? What was their thinking, your thinking? Because you're leaving a law firm again, and this is a much different animal than like a Fortune 100, I would think, or a Fortune 1 company.
Yeah, so candidly, it was a couple of things. I went to my then managing partner at Littler, a guy named Tom Bender, and said to Tom, like, Tom, this thing's going great, but if you gave me $2 million, I could turn my 10 into 25. Um, we need more investment. And Tom's response to me was, Aaron, we're a law firm, not a data
Mhm.
company. Um, $2 million, right? Like, we're just, everything's fine. Just, keep it going as is. Status quo is great. Um, but I had some things that I wanted to do, and I wanted to try things that I wanted when I was in house that I thought should exist,
Mhm.
didn't. A more grand application of data to beyond, pay equity and wage an hour and sort of, labor and sort of some of the stuff that we were playing with at Littler. Um, and about the time I was thinking about that, Dave Deppie and Dan Reed uh, and connected with me, and we're like, hey, we we have this vision, but we need somebody to help on the data side of it. And Dave has since gone off to be the CEO of Repario. He's building and growing an organization over there, and Dan has become the chairman of the board here. So that my initial stakeholders have, but the vision of UnitedLex as a data company for legal, it's a legal services company that leverages data and data science to help legal teams across litigation and investigations, IP, contracting, and legal ops. Right in the you know, data mining in incident response. Like if you look at what we do, it really is this taking and applying data and technology to improving and speeding up and expanding legal services. So it's a pure play innovation role, and in a world where the parallels between what's happening in AI now and what happened in e-discovery 15 years ago are very similar,
Yep.
right? When e-discovery first launched, like all of the cutting edge stuff was done by service providers, right? And so all of like kind of the talent grew up largely inside of the service providers. The technical chops grew up inside of the service providers, and then it migrated from service providers to law
Mhm.
firms, right? And law firms kind of continued to hone the spear, and service providers doing the same thing and working together, and then a lot of that talent moved in
Mhm.
house,
Yep.
right? Um, and you've seen that cycle continues, but that's kind of like service providers were the first mover, law firms then came next, and then in-house started basically like how much of this can we bring in and run ourselves. And I think you're seeing that same process replay with AI now. And so UnitedLex in that service provider space really is what has been the opportunity for the last several years to really get deep in how far can you push the data science envelope in the name of helping and improving and expanding legal services?
Um, what are in what you're allowed to talk about as far as either law firm clients or in-house teams who get it? Like I've heard stories of two
Yeah.
comparable Fortune 500s competing, and one of them is like in the dark ages and the other one is like Star Trek. And it's interesting to me the dissonance that still is occurring out there with legal teams and law firms um, adopting technology and advanced uses of a technology.
Yeah, so I would say that the span of that is really, really wide. I think in-house teams increasingly are getting pushed from, their leadership from the C-suite down to adopt these technologies because they're being adopted across the business, and increasingly, like everybody says increasingly, but we've been saying increasingly for 10 years. Increasingly, legal departments are being asked to be run just like any other aspect of the
Yeah.
business, right? To be as efficient as possible, to do more with less, like all the things. Um, so I think there are a lot of places where that push is very real. Um, I think heavily regulated industries are often your slowest to adopt
Really
for obvious reasons.
interesting.
Yeah, the at least here, right? I think especially if they're like European based, because they've got a lot of data privacy, data
Mm,
security. Like there are the number of hoops necessary to jump to bring that kind of technology in house are multitudinous and very high. And so, I think a lot of those folks are looking for partners either on the service provider side, the law firm side. Although, I always think that distinction is really interesting because we're all service providers, in-house team at some level.
hmm
But they're looking for those outside players because the internal friction to bringing it in is so high. It needs to be sort of vetted and validated and proven before they're gonna, kind of like e-discovery was early
Yeah.
on, right? And then there are other folks who are moving really, really rapidly. We've got a client that does. They're a spin out of kind of a pharma, and they do products in that space, and they are increasingly one of the most technology and data driven legal departments that I'm aware of right now. And we're working hand in glove with them. In fact, I'm helping them shape their AI strategy as a legal department right now. Bob and I are building that out, and um, so you kind of have the gamut there, and you have a bunch of folks who are in between. And what I tell clients all the time is thinking about um, like the way to do this is to think about very practical, very scalable applications of these tech. They're not silver bullets, but you can build them to handle kind of discrete aspects of process that are expensive, time consuming, high risk, carry a lot of friction, right? So like we just built a generative AI driven privilege module. And what it does is it autonomously drafts the descriptions of documents that have been tagged as being privileged in a
Interesting.
litigation,
Yeah.
right? Uh, Historically, that has been a human
Okay.
driven process. So documents would be tagged as being privileged in a review. Those documents would go to a team of people who would like read the document and then write the description that would go into the privilege log. Uh, it's tedious. It's super time consuming. People start making mistakes because they've been doing it for several hours in a row. Like the human mind can't focus
Yeah.
for that long. Uh, and our people were really good at it. But what we found was that um, when and initially we built that module to be a step for those humans because of the issues associated with it. And then what we found was that the module was so good that we could flip that thing on its head, have the machine do the first draft, and the humans are now they're reviewing like a summary of the documents, right? And then they're reviewing the description for readability and compliance with the local rules. And so it's 40% cheaper and 75% faster. So it creates more space for outside counsel to review and get in their edits without being time crunched at the very end. It just makes the entire process better. It's not trying to like solve all of the of document review through generative AI. Very narrow, scalable process that takes a bunch of friction out of one piece that's a total pain point. And so, the ones who are kind of in the middle, that's how I talk to them about that. But on the firm front, I will say this, and maybe to nobody's great surprise, I just met with a firm in Miami last week. They're a plaintiff's
Okay.
firm. They are the most data intensive, data advanced law firm I've ever
Fun.
encountered. Uh, they buy and litigate Medicare and Medicaid related payment claims. Um, and they are structuring all of that and mining all of that data in the course of their regular practice. Um, and it is astounding the level of insight that they have about their, and they do not think of cases separate and apart from the data analysis portion of it. And I firmly believe that that's the
Yeah.
future. Uh, but these guys are living in like 2057, because they have fully bought in to the concept and they're leveraging it every single day.
Um, it's amazing. And uh, so kind of take a couple steps back. You talked about
Yep.
the language of statistics and how that is really the kind of the underpinnings of most of the data crunching today, and how the algorithms are built. Um, from a hiring perspective, from a talent perspective, um, are you finding corporate legal departments and maybe law firms hiring more MBAs or more data scientists? Or what are some of these essential skills that you're seeing kind of coming as things are evolving?
Um, Kind of like I always do. Like I'm gonna break that one into pieces. So um, everybody is trying to hire data scientists, right? And I think that I think people use the term data scientist um, sort of interchangeably with like engineers or some of the other pieces and parts of data analysts, like some of the other pieces and parts of the process. A data scientist, in my definition, is a person who thinks about novel ways that data can be leveraged to produce outcomes. Right? They're really kind of like pushing the edge of what's possible. Um, and then you have data engineers and folks who spend all their time coding and stuff like that, who then sort of work behind to put that together, right? Um, so I see law firms and in-house teams hiring data scientists, hiring data analysts, to some extent hiring engineers. Um, I think law firms are hiring more than, and service providers are hiring more than in-house teams, and that's mostly a budget issue, right? In a lot of organizations, like if they're going to spend money on, if Walmart's going to spend money on data scientists, they're probably putting those to use figuring out the Pop-Tart water thing to sell more stuff rather than like how many slip and falls do we have last week? Um, so I think that, in most in-house teams that I'm seeing, like that's a kind of a place where you get a bottleneck, a narrowing. They don't like legal ops teams are most effective when they have deep data and data
Mm-hmm.
analysis. A lot of there are some that are super well resourced, but I think a lot of them are missing that place where in-house can tie up with providers or firms depending on kind of what that skill set is and what that relationship is, and really move things forward. Um, in terms of skill sets, a couple of really interesting things. I used to say that um, I thought the future looked like a world where people needed certain kind of basic coding knowledge in the same way that you need like basic math and basic English to be successful in the United States. Um, while generative AI right now is what I would call a fairly mediocre coder, um, you can do some very cool stuff by essentially really strong prompt engineering today. And so I think the CEO of NVIDIA came out and said, actually, like in the near future, we don't think people are going to largely need to know how to code. Like we're going to build machines that have that, and you explain what you want, and it'll largely be handled by the machine. And then you'll have a group of people who are on the elite edge of coding because a generative system is a closed loop in the sense that it only knows what it knows, and so you need people to push that informational envelope. um, and I think that is now largely true. I think like a layperson can do a lot from a building stuff standpoint, leveraging open access generative models. um, and in fact, one of the things that I think is super interesting is actually what I call the pipeline problem that I think we're about to have. And I think this is a space where law firms and in-house really need to be thinking hard, I think. Um, I'm very lucky in that I get to watch a person in my life. She's finishing her freshman year of college. Okay. And I've been able to watch her all year as she's gone through college, and all of her papers, like if she's writing papers for classes or if she's doing projects for classes, she leverages at least three, if not more, open source LLM available tools, right? And like the first one gives a rough draft, the second one essentially improves that draft, the third one obscures the fact that LLMs wrote it, right? And then the fourth one checks to make sure it's not going to get hit for like plagiarism or whatever. She is absolutely killing college right now, right? Um, and I think that's amazing. But what strikes me as I've been watching this is, okay, so she's a freshman. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that she decided to end college and
Okay.
go to law school. Graduate, she's going to go to law school. So she got 3 more years of undergrad, right? And she's going to have 3 years of law school. So, and then she's going to take the bar. So let's say 7 years from now, right? She is joining a firm, or maybe is hired directly into an in-house team. That happens. It's rare, but it does
Mhm.
happen. There are folks who work like that. Um, it is likely that she will have spent the last 7 years of her formal education, all of her upper tier education, never drafting any original, right? And we build and train lawyers largely
To
through
do
the
that.
writing
Yeah.
process. Reading,
Yeah.
writing. We build arguments through writing, we refine arguments through writing, we initially assert them through writing, and then the oral argument phase is the nuances and the well, what
Mhm.
abouts, right? Um, that entire paradigm
Shifts.
is like eviscerated in a decade. And what is the model that we're going to use to build and train lawyers if they're not writing anything from scratch, right? And it creates this very interesting next conversation, which is, as these generative tools get better, and we're using a lot of them, like we use them to draft briefs and complaints for law firms and for clients, and we hand them packets that's like, really strong first draft, edit from here and file this, right? Um, the natural sort of extension of that is that lawyers increasingly will become editors, not
Interesting.
authors. And again, how do you train up the next generation of lawyers when you're automating big pieces of what I call that spade work, which is where young lawyers right now are
Hmm.
built,
Yeah.
right? They're doing higher level, more strategically important work early on, but they're not spending the time, they're not writing from the time they're students. They're certainly not writing when they're coming in as, first, second, third, fourth year associates. And those folks who are now, first, second, third year associates, by the time they're fifth, sixth, seventh year associates, a lot of what they're doing is going to be editing, not writing. We don't have an academy for that. Like, talk about the innovation dilemma, right? Like, you're talking about re-engineering the fundamentals of an entire industry, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, so the training of lawyers, the retraining of existing lawyers who are still drafting, the ones that have been doing it for 40 years, those dynamics. I absolutely agree with you. It's pretty wild. You mentioned NVIDIA CEO. He was on campus here at Columbia, and he said this: AI is not going to take your job. The person using AI is going to take that job, and it just
Yep.
reaffirmed exactly what you said.
Yeah, I used to, the way I have often phrased this, and I used to say this when I was doing the like data analytics work at Littler, right? It's like bringing a machine gun to a rock fight. It's fundamentally unfair. Like, it just, like, you've got no, um, because you just got so many more arrows in the
Yeah.
quiver. You know what I mean? Like, and that really is the way to think about it, because these technologies, there's no one of them that's a silver bullet. You kind of mesh them all together, kind of like the way I was describing, uh, the young lady in college, like how she puts papers together, right? It's multiple technologies being layered together, essentially in a workflow, to produce an output that is better than what she could produce on her own.
Which I think is what you guys do at UnitedLex. You've described to me how you guys are layering tech to do that, to create the workflows.
Yeah, I think that's right. Right. The kind of old saw of people process technology is very, very true. Um, but and I say all the time, innovation is a people centered uh, endeavor first, right? It's the people and the skill sets, and then you're augmenting them with process technology. I think a lot of people think innovation and they think technology first, but you can make really significant improvements in how outputs work, the efficiency of a process, the cost reduction, the risk reduction, just by creating more process around it, or injecting some additional skill sets into it before you even bother with tech.
So, Aaron, I mean, you just brought up your innovation philosophy, which you'd mentioned is human first, then tech. Um, do you have any other frontier predictions? You mentioned how dramatic things are going to be transformed for students being trained, law students. What other things should people be thinking about that 10 years out? Um,
It's such a great question. I'm a big believer that those who live by crystal balls are destined to eat ground glass. So, all this comes with like a big, grain of salt, proviso, asterisk on top of it, whatever. Um, so, if you look at generative technology in particular, right? It's generative technology is doing a statistical analysis of the words that have come before, and it is doing a statistical calculation of what the next proper word is, right? At its most basic level. But that process is going to continue to get better. A lot of what legal professionals across the profession are doing today, a lot of the process of creating work product is going to be automated. Um, and it's going to be a lot of your fact gathering, right? It's going to be technology centric. It's already technology centric, but it's going to be increasingly more so. It's going to get faster. Information synthesis is going to get faster. Um, and work product creation is largely going to be automated. And so, what does that mean for lawyers? You look at lawyers and legal professionals generally, a lot of what they do today is that process of finding information, synthesizing that information, and then turning that information synthesis into work product, and then turning that work product into advice or an argument or whatever, right? Um, if a lot of that what we spend our day to day doing now is handled by technology, then a couple of things happen. It frees legal professionals up to jump up a rung in terms of what they're doing day to day, right? More sophisticated work, more impactful work, not just stuff that has to get done, right? Like what I call run the business. Like you got to do it. It's not strategically important, but it needs to be done in order for the strategically important thing to happen. Um, that all I think largely gets handled by tech, and that there's a revenue issue for law firms, there's a spend issue for legal departments, there's a revenue and spend issue for service providers, that's going to have to fundamentally be rethought a little bit, I think, as a result of that. Um, but I think that there's a couple of other kind of really interesting pieces to it. So assume that all of that's the case. What does that do for an organization? The running joke when I was in house was everybody in house played two rungs down from their title, right? If you looked at what we were doing day to day, like my title is A, but I'm really playing it C, just because I'm in the day to day nonsense. And the kind of running joke was like, what would this place be like if we could all just jump up one rung, right? If instead of like operating at the senior vice president level, which is my title, like if I was just able to operate at VP instead of director level stuff, like what would that do for the organization? I think that is going to be a really interesting conversation because it's going to be an up leveling. And then I think a couple of other things that are sort of interesting on the law firm side of the house. I think where tech is and where tech is going to allow smaller, less resourced firms to reach up, kind of up the food chain, if you will, to doing more sophisticated work that right now is maybe outside of what they can credibly do, right? It's going to let them sort of up level their practice. Interestingly, though, I think at the same time, it's going to allow large, like law firms, to reach down toward work that right now wouldn't be economically viable for them. And I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation over the next 5 to 10 years.
We've run out of time, and you just dropped kind of a little bit of an A-bomb of very fascinating thought experiment with what you just shared. So we'll just leave this as a tease. And Aaron, I'm sure people are going to have questions. How can they find you, contact you, follow you on social media?
LinkedIn is probably the best. Okay. It's Aaron Crews, AARONCREWS. I love to connect and kind of bounce around what I'm thinking about. I'm on X as well, ESIESQ, like electronically stored information lawyer, right? ESI. So you can find either of those places. And candidly, I'm always trying to learn from the folks I connect with. I put stuff out, but more than that, I absorb.
Aaron, it's been an honor and pleasure. Thank you for just this wealth of time today. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This was a pleasure.